Thank you all for attending FDA and Emergency Response. I'm Carmel Shachar, the Executive Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. It's my pleasure to welcome you. I'm going to go through a few housekeeping items before we get into the meat of the event. If you have any technical issues throughout the event, and I sure hope that you don't, the best way to get our attention so that we can help you is to email petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu. Again, petrie-flom@law.harvard.edu, and we'll do our best to help you. We will be sharing the fully captioned event video with all registrants within 1 to 2 weeks. An email will pop up in your inbox saying that it has been captioned and it's now posted to the website. Please feel free to share that video with your friends and colleagues who might have been interested in this event but couldn't make it. If you like what you see at this event and are interested in more, I'd suggest that you sign up for our newsletter. It goes out only twice a month, so we do not clog your inbox, and it's by far the best way to learn about the various events that the Petrie-Flom Center is doing, as well as scholarship, and what is happening on our blog, Bill of Health. Speaking of that, if you are looking for the source of some really thoughtful, cutting edge, but accessible scholarship on important questions facing health law and policy, could be anything from clinical research ethics to the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines to the impact of the pandemic on social structures, please check out our blog, Bill of Health. If you are interested in our co-sponsor, the Harvard Law School Library has generously co-sponsored this event. We've put their website on the slide up there. So hls.harvard.edu/library. And with those housekeeping out of the way, I want to hand you over to today's moderator. That is Glenn Cohen, who is the James A. Atwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law and Deputy Dean at Harvard Law School, but also the Faculty Director of the Petrie-Flom Center. Glenn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carmel, and thank you all for being with us. So I'm going to just briefly introduce Mark Raza. Mark is the Chief Counsel of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, where he leads an office of more than 140 attorneys. He's worked in the FDA's Office of Chief Counsel since 1990 when he graduated from Harvard Law School. He's a proud alum. Over the years, in the office, he's practiced in a variety of different legal areas, including civil and criminal litigation, biologics counseling, and also international law. He served as the Principal Deputy Chief Counsel for about 10 years, and also as the Acting Deputy for Policy in FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health. He leads OCC's COVID-19 pandemic response team and has played an integral role in FDA's emergency preparedness and response activities for over 20 years. So he's an ideal person to hear from today on this subject. He's going to talk about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have some conversation about what he's talked about. So Mark, I think with that, I'm going to turn off my video and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Glenn. And thank you, Carmel. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a real honor for someone like myself as an alum to receive an invitation to and an opportunity to speak with you all on some topics in food and drug law. I'm sure some of you have studied in the area, have taken courses or are doing some research. Others may be generally interested in the subject. Whatever the case, I would commend food and drug law practice to you as a very interesting area of the law, incredibly rich, incredibly deep. And it's really amazing to me as someone who graduated long ago from the law school to see the many and varied offerings, both courses that are offered and also the work of the Petrie-Flom Center. So I would just encourage you in your time as a student. I know you have a lot going on, but to really try and make the most of these opportunities as you have the chance. I've been at FDA's Office of Chief Counsel for over 32 years. I didn't plan it that way, but one reason I have stayed so long is that I find the field, I find food and drug law to be incredibly interesting. I'm always, each product area is a bit different. And even though I've done a lot of different things over the years, I'm constantly finding new and interesting aspects, either things I didn't know or maybe things I did a long time ago and I've forgotten about. And also being at the agency, for me, it's been an opportunity to do meaningful and relevant work. And so I'd like to perhaps more towards the end of our session today, talk to you some about federal service, but I would just like to put it on your radar screen, if you're a student, to think about as you're going forward in your career, opportunities to work in the federal government for a federal agency, Department of Health and Human Services, Office of General Counsel, provides legal services to many different of the operating divisions within HHS, maybe the Department of Justice, but just put it on your radar screen. So the FDA's Office of the Chief Counsel has a very strong connection to Harvard Law School. I'll start with Peter Hutt, an HLS graduate who was the Chief Counsel of FDA in the early to mid 1970s. I was in touch with Peter last night. He said this winter term will be his 30th year of teaching his course on food and drug law at the law school. In many ways, he is the godfather of modern food and drug law. He wrote the case book. After Peter, I'd say Rich Cooper was a chief counsel in the late 70s in the Carter administration, an HLS graduate, a summa cum laude graduate of the law school who clerked for Justice Brennan. After he was the chief counsel, he worked at Williams and Connolly and argued the Brown and Williamson case, which, if you're not familiar with, was cited quite extensively in the recent West Virginia EPA case. To the present day, Stacey Amin, I believe class of 2004, was the chief counsel the last couple of years in the Trump administration. And I spoke with you all a couple of years ago, I guess more than a couple, but I was hired in 1989 by Mike Astrew, an HLS grad who was the young general counsel of HHS at the time. And I kind of lucked out because Mike came to interview on campus, and I interviewed, and I had an definite interest in food and drug law, and it just worked out. The chief counsel of FDA at the time, Margaret Jane Porter, was an HLS grad. And I'll end this long litany with the current general counsel of the Department of HHS, Sam Bagenstos, is an HLS grad in the maybe early 90s after me, but he was a recipient of the FAE diploma. So out of about 140 attorneys in our office, we have a number of HLS graduates, including former members of the law review. I think in general, folks find it to be a very interesting, high-level practice. We interact routinely with senior leadership in the agency, in the department, in the White House. If you're litigating, you work with Main Justice in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and also civil appellate and the Solicitor General's office. As mentioned, we have about 140 attorneys. We're divided into litigation and counseling functions. On the litigation side, we have a civil practice that does enforcement and defensive work, and then a team of lawyers that do criminal work with the Office of Criminal Investigations. On the counseling side, which is the majority of our attorneys, we are on center-based teams, so the FDA centers. So there's a drugs team, a devices team, a biologics team, foods team, et cetera. We also have a number of cross-cutting teams on issues like human subject protection, combination products, information disclosure. We are part of the HHS Office of General Counsel that has, we're the largest division. They have divisions servicing every operating division of the department. So a CMS division, a public health division that provides services to CDC and NIH, a general law division that does procurement and personnel work. So for FDA, we do only substantive food and drug law and related work. So at FDA, lately things have been very busy. They seems like they're always busy, but they've been especially busy in the last few months. Dr. Califf has been the commissioner for about 6 months, and just some things that are on the front burner include user fee reauthorization, nutrition related work, opioids, women's health issues, among other things. And as well as sort of just the customary and usual work that that is part of being a regulatory agency. In terms of emergency preparedness and response, I'm going to talk mostly about the COVID-19 pandemic, but we continue to be fully engaged with the pandemic work, and then also with monkeypox. I was just earlier this morning, I was on a meeting with senior leadership of the agency, hearing the latest. It looks like things are trending in the right direction. There's a randomized clinical trial for a therapeutic that's also was under expanded access, and CDC recently issued some revised guidelines for that. The vaccine seems to be available now, the Jynneos vaccine, and the intradermal route of administration, that seems to be going well. Another area of emergency work has been the infant formula crisis over the last months. This has been something that's been a whole of government effort, but FDA has been at the forefront, obviously, and my office has been very involved. We've had we have senior leadership meetings twice a day with the commissioner. It's gone down to once a day, and the Center for Foods and the Office of Regulatory Affairs have been very involved. Obviously, my office has been involved with the consent decree for Abbott Sturgis facility, and also for working out to facilitate the way for importation under an enforcement discretion policy of infant formula from abroad. It looks at the moment like the supply issues are going in the right direction. So we're still not completely out of the woods yet. There's concerns about specialty and metabolic formula, but again, it appears as though things are going in the right direction. So I'm going to turn now to some of the history of FDA's emergency preparedness and response activities. The agency's work in this area highlights some of its core functions. At a basic level, FDA engages in two main regulatory activities: licensing and compliance. For medical products, this entails a complex regulatory framework for pre-market approval, clearance, authorization. For all products that FDA regulates, the agency works to try to ensure compliance with pre- and post-market requirements, such as current good manufacturing practice and truthful and non-misleading labeling. In the emergency arena, a core or central question then becomes, how can FDA help facilitate the availability of needed products when the products are unapproved or investigational? From a historical perspective, tied to my over 30 years at the agency, I can say from personal knowledge that this question arose several times in the 1990s. For example, from the use of investigational drugs to protect US troops from chemical warfare in Gulf War I, to FDA's involvement in the regulation of ideologic agents that could be used as bioterror weapons. In the mid-1990s, as an example of that, an individual in Ohio was able to order and receive Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, from the American Type Culture Collection, a non-governmental repository of biological specimens that at the time was located, strangely, was located very close to former FDA headquarters in Rockville, Maryland. All of this culminated on 9/11 and thereafter with the subsequent concern about terrorist attacks using chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons to attack the homeland. On 9/11 itself, FDA evacuated its headquarters, which was in the largest office building in Montgomery County, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., the Park Lawn building. There were over 4,000 HHS employees, including FDA employees, in the building, including my office, the Office of Chief Counsel. We were all sent home and the building was closed. In the confusion of that day, some thought that that building itself could be a potential target. Later that evening, 3 of us were called back to the building to work on emergency issues concerning getting blood supplies to Ground Zero in New York City. Tragically, it turned out that the blood was not needed, but this effort put us on the path over the next 3 years of trying to wrangle flexibility and practicality out of the various requirements pertaining to the safety and effectiveness of emergency countermeasures. 9/11, the anthrax attacks, and concerns about other potential bioterrorist events led to the enactment of the Emergency Use Authority as part of Project BioShield in 2004. If you're not familiar with it, this is the EUA, or Emergency Use Authority provision, found in Section 564 of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. When this legislative proposal was being considered around 2002, FDA argued at first that the existing regulatory framework for investigational products was sufficient, in that it could provide for expanded and streamlined access in emergency scenarios, and could, as the agency is always interested in, generating data to figure out if an unapproved medical countermeasure actually works and is safe enough to give in a certain situation. The leadership of Health and Human Services Department determined that certain requirements of the investigational drug paradigm, excuse me, a light went off, of the paradigm were simply too burdensome, including the documentation of human subject protection requirements. So I was assigned as the lead drafter for FDA on a team of HHS OGC attorneys who work closely with the relevant House Committee health staffers to come up with a regulatory vehicle that allowed for the deployment of medical countermeasures in exigent circumstances, but with protections built in, and with the ability for the agency to impose conditions, including data monitoring and reporting. The result was Section 564. Some of the safeguards built in include the requirement that first, the secretary has to make a determination that there's a public health emergency that could affect national security. On the basis of that determination, the secretary then, as a second step, makes a declaration that the circumstances exist justifying the authorization. Once that is done, if, among other things, based on the totality of the scientific evidence available, FDA finds that the known and potential benefits of the product outweigh its known and potential risks, as well as the risks of the disease-causing agent, the agency can issue an EUA. FDA can impose conditions on the EUA as necessary and appropriate to protect the public health. Now, this EUA authority was intended to provide FDA with flexibility to make medical countermeasures available rapidly in particular circumstances if supported by an adequate risk-benefit analysis. The agency has discretion in the amount of data and information that it will require to make the risk-benefit determination. This is so the agency can effectively address different types of situations, from a hypothetical dirty bomb set off in a densely populated area to a weaponized smallpox or anthrax attack to a pandemic. In theory, the EUA provision gives FDA authority to turn on a dime and authorize a product with minimal data. Now, over the years, the EUA authority has been used in different public health emergencies. For example, to authorize diagnostic tests in the Ebola epidemic and the Zika outbreak. Over time, as maybe would be expected, and as the program has become solidified administratively, FDA has wanted to see more rather than less data concerning the product's safety and information and effectiveness. And often this data is requested in pre-EUA submissions to FDA. For the COVID-19 pandemic, the Office of the Chief Counsel set up a team of attorneys that eventually grew to over 40 in number, not including all the attorneys litigating enforcement and defensive cases. These attorneys focused on devices, including tests and PPE, therapeutic drugs, biological products, including blood products and vaccines, food regulation issues, and health fraud. There was some grinding of the gears in FDA's overall response, but the agency proved to be quite creative and effective in how it addressed the pandemic. For diagnostic tests, for example, which are the first line of defense in an outbreak, CDRH used innovative approaches such as umbrella EUAs covering categories of diagnostics, with some self-certification or notification by the manufacturer based upon validation criteria. This helped the agency deal with the thousands of incoming EUA requests it received for diagnostic tests. CDRH also worked with test developers to create templates for EUA requests and expedites paths to market, especially for at-home tests. FDA partnered with NIH to establish an independent test assessment program to streamline validation and authorization of antigen tests with potential for large-scale manufacturing. Overall, let me just read you some of the numbers here. As of earlier this month, the agency had authorized 438 tests and sample collection devices, including 301 molecular tests and sample collection devices, 85 antibody and other immune response tests, 51 antigen tests, and 1 diagnostic breath test. There were 78 molecular authorizations and 1 antibody authorization that can be used with home collected samples. So I think that reflects an awful lot of work, some grinding of the gears, some going back and revoking EUAs that turned out for products that turned out they weren't as sensitive or specific as the agency initially thought. But overall, I think it speaks to a successful response on the testing front. Regarding vaccines, the development and manufacturing and authorization of COVID-19 vaccines that are safe and effective is a monumental public health achievement that has potentially saved millions of lives. Early on in the pandemic, FDA made clear that in order for the agency to authorize a vaccine, it would require data that would enable it to determine that the vaccine was safe and effective, more than just the benefits exceeded the risks under the EUA construct. This was done in a compressed time frame and with some extrapolation of data, but with significant safety data and with phase 3 clinical trials. As part of this work, the agency consulted with its advisory committee, the Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee, the VRPAC, and then went to CDC. With the CDC consulted with the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practice, and then made recommendations for use, which concurred with the FDA authorization. So again, the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, all of the subsequent amendments to provide for different age ranges, the boosters, which are ongoing, as we know. Again, I think it's a monumental achievement. There has been some grinding of the gears, but it reflects an awful lot of work by agency scientists, policymakers, and by my office. Let me finish up this portion of by mentioning the subject of political interference, which so much has been written about this subject, including a recent report by the House Select Committee on the coronavirus crisis, which focused on the previous administration's involvement in FDA work on hydroxychloroquine, convalescent plasma, and COVID-19 vaccines. While I will say that some unusual things occurred, it is also true, I believe, that Operation Warp Speed was an unparalleled success, particularly in the making available safe and effective vaccines. It's also true that FDA's political staff, the commissioner, the chief of staff, the deputy commissioner for policy, and the chief counsel did their utmost to enable the agency to do its scientific work in the politically charged atmosphere of the pandemic crisis. I'm a non-political career employee. It's a bit unusual that someone like me is in the chief counsel job. In the past, this job has generally been a political job for a political appointee. But to me, the most important thing that I can do and that my office can do is to support the agency's work by upholding the law and letting agency policymakers know what the legal risks are when they want to take a certain initiative, and also that when the law, there's not a way to do what they want to do when the law says no. I've seen good and not so good in both Democrat and Republican administrations. It just depends. On certain of the issues, as one can imagine, like preemption, enforcement, regulation of advertising and promotional labeling, the pendulum swings back and forth a bit, constrained by developments in the case law. But I would submit that the vast majority of the work that we do and the core work that we do is somewhere in the middle, and it's work that needs to get done. And it's important work. Now, it's not necessarily the emergency work, but it's work that needs to get done. I do think that in emergency response, that again, there's core work that different sides, different perspectives would agree upon needs to get done and should get carried out in the way that it has been. So let me stop there and let's see if there are questions.
Great, that was a super comprehensive, Mark. I guess I'm going to start by asking, so one thing I found so interesting is at the very beginning you covered a really very heterogeneous group of quote unquote emergencies, right? From 9/11 to COVID-19. And I'm wondering, when you kind of look over the long haul, but also the more recent short haul, let's say the last couple of years, whether there are commonalities related to these emergencies and the challenges that FDA faced, whether each one kind of is very different on its own. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit about, the idea of there being a playbook for emergencies, or whether the thing about emergencies is they defy every playbook you could imagine.
That's interesting. I think it's a mix of both. So over the years, especially after 9/11, so I developed this sort of by accident, this expertise in this area, and I asked to get out of it several times, and I was told no. But I did participate a number of times in USG wide or HHS tabletop exercises, and I never thought that we would actually see what we've experienced in the last couple of years with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I mean, Dr. Fauci said that, it was, if a pandemic was going to occur, it was going to be sort of a respiratory virus but I didn't think it would happen. I don't, maybe call me naive. Now, I think there's sort of it's both that there are similarities and differences. So for the possibility of attacks of bioweapons, that sort of thing, if there was to be an incident, and then also for pandemics, you're sort of, and depending on the nature of it, pandemic or an epidemic, you're looking at detection, treatment, of course, and then moving towards a vaccine. So the availability of those products and the work that needs to be done to determine if they should be made available and then make them available and then related questions about importation, export, et cetera, there is some commonality there. What's different is that, of course, every situation is different on the facts, and so different and unique issues come up. I'll say sort of again, but both similar and different is the pressure that the agency has felt, especially recently, from stakeholders who are very concerned, either as patient groups, as advocacy groups, or manufacturers. And I think it's been magnified by social media. The commissioner is very concerned about the topic of misinformation, and as exemplified in the COVID-19 space, where the information that is being put out about vaccines or therapeutics is just maybe there can be some debate, but I think the sort of the mainstream view is that it's simply untrue. And so how do you combat that effectively? And the FDA's Office of External Affairs is seeking to be proactive along with the commissioner to try to engage on the same terrain with tweets, with kind of pithy social media type responses, where my office is more conservative and thinks sort of more information and in-depth information is preferred. But we're being told by our experts that we're losing that battle. So I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But that's again kind of extrapolating from similar and difference. But that's one thing that we're seeing these days.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the tweet. I was thinking about the "You are not a horse" or whatever it was tweet that got a lot of attention. And I think this is interesting also, in that I think lawyers by our nature, we can be pithy when we're pressed to do so, but we tend to like to be precise, which is sometimes in tension with being pithy. It's interesting what you said about social media. When I think about like the longer history of FDA, if you could say, is ivermectin like Laetrile, but Laetrile plus social media, right? When we go back to Laetrile, which was, popular, ultimately disproven cancer kind of treatment that, was the subject of a series of cases involving, Rutherford and Ninth Circuit on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you think a little bit about, or I do at least, the kind of relationship between FDA and ACT UP during the early periods of the HIV epidemic, right? And this idea of kind of the way in which pressure was pushed and what today pressure looks like versus elsewhere. That's sort of interesting to think of these historical analogs and how they play out so differently in a world where it's not day by day or week by week decision making, but it's in the moment that suddenly, so-and-so is tweeting about how their cousin in Jamaica, for example, had X and Y side effect. That it really does put a lot of pressure on you and on FDA to respond very quickly.
Right. So the FDA press folks are very proud of their tweet. It was something like, "You're not a horse, you're not a pig, come on, y'all." And they said it received an unprecedented number of likes or retweets or whatever. So I've been told I'm a dinosaur. So I'm admittedly old school, but we're currently in litigation in the Southern District of Texas, where the allegation is that FDA impermissibly interfered with the practice of medicine, and that's one of the exhibits that's cited, and that FDA doesn't have the ability to speak, which we are vehemently opposing, or any kind of limitation in that way. But it is a real issue going forward. And the commissioner was here in 2016. My office and I, we opposed him tweeting, and he's still kind of bitter about that. He then left. Scott Gottlieb came in and just tweeted, he didn't even ask us. And I think it was very effective in how he kind of managed that. Rob Califf went to Google. He frequently says he was at Google the last 5 years, enjoying a great life in San Francisco. with probably one of the most powerful social media and platforms in the world. And then he was called back here. But, you know, he's pointed out just how kind of behind the 8 ball and behind the game the agency is. Now, I'm not sure what the solution is. I mean, I think if you, to some extent, if the game's being fought in the gutter, like if you don't, or being played, if you don't play, then you got to live with the result. On the other hand, if you play in the gutter, you're going to get covered in dirt. So, you know, what do you do? I mean, it's interesting about the evolution of in response to HIV, AIDS and HIV. So I think everyone would agree that the activist community, it led to expanded access and all sorts of improvements in products becoming available more quickly and getting approved more quickly. And when it was a little bit before my time when I joined in 1990, but 2 years before, the activists actually took over the Park Lawn building that I was talking about. There was no security at the time. They came in and took over the whole building. And folks in my office when I started used to still talk about that as sort of a seminal event.
Well, if I can quote the tweet back at you, you are not a horse, you are not a pig, you're also not a dinosaur. I think you're giving yourself too little credit here in terms of the animal kingdom. I want to ask a little bit about the forward-looking piece about emergency planning. So this is, again, a real challenge, right? So you've had this experience with COVID-19. And my understanding, a layperson from the outside, has been in some of the periods of time, you know, people were working around the clock and reviewing really heroic efforts at FDA and reviewing submissions and the like. When you think about the possibility of a future zoonotic, transmission episode or other kinds of emergencies around the pipeline, are there things the agency is thinking about now that it has to accomplish and get on track in terms of its organization or staffing that might be helpful for the next pandemic, or it's just, let us catch our breath a little bit?
Yeah, no, thank you for saying the agency's heroic efforts. I mean, I would agree with that characterization. Certain parts of the agency worked around the clock, including parts of my office. Different parts of regulated industry have been arguing that is the rate at which the agency should ordinarily work in terms of clearing new products or pre-market approval or whatever, which I think is just simply not realistic. But that, not to sound too bureaucratic, but the agency does have in place sort of programmatic offices to deal with this. Yeah, they were in place before, but there's an office, OCET, the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats. That's the agency clearinghouse for all EUAs from the medical product centers. Work closely with the centers, and the centers themselves, CDER, CBER, CDRH, have emergency preparedness folks who work on these issues and then coordinate with the relevant review division. So, for example, Peter Marks has been involved himself in CBER, but he has, David Cho for vaccines, who then works. He's not in the Office of Vaccines. He works for Peter, but he works very closely with the Office of Vaccines for all the COVID-19 issues. So, I think programmatically we're well situated. There has been, it's been a drain on people like other industries and other areas in the country where some people have left, and retention is a real issue, hiring and retention, scientists and biostatisticians, et cetera. There is some hiring authority that's part of the user fee package. Hopefully that'll go through, but I think that'll go a long way.
Great. So now I want to just shift focus a little bit to maybe a geographical question, which is to say, FDA is a federal agency, has a very national scope. And one of the things that we saw during the pandemic was essentially state borders and even national borders becoming less relevant. And I'm curious, maybe I'll start by asking you, within the United States, in terms of emergency responses, it's quite hard to harmonize across not just 50 states, but often a lot of devolution to local governments. And we saw this during the early phase, especially of the pandemic. I'm curious if you could just give you an opportunity to say a little bit about FDA trying to work with state agencies, local agencies, and trying to work beyond the federal government if there are lessons learned or insights you've kind of derived from that experience.
I mean, it's hard to say lessons learned. A lot of that work was carried out by CDC and maybe ASPR with state and local partners. FDA was involved to an extent. I mean, we had some early on questions that were mostly theoretical, but we put out some information about conflicting requirements, state requirements with the authorization, and also some questions that are sort of at the pharmacist level, so it gets into the practice of pharmacy. But the deployment of products, from the Strategic National Stockpile, the SNS, and particularly with state partners, that was handled mostly by colleagues in HHS with whom we worked closely. Hard to say lessons learned. I mean, a lot of it's kind of fog of war stuff. And so, I mean, I do think certainly any opportunity to build in efficiencies going forward, but it's just, I don't know, and to some extent, it was what it is what it was. I mean, what do you have any, from your vantage point, any
No, I mean, I think it's quite tough, as you say, right? And I think you are right to say that, the entire alphabet soup within HHS was kind of involved in terms of the agencies. My own view, and this is my 2 cents, but it's less about FDA than it is about CDC, is that when we do comparative analysis with other countries that had strong public health reactions, places like Canada, places like Australia, their centralization of some of the functions that we've devolved to local governments, I think, especially in the first 6 months of the pandemic, was a huge advantage, right? Now, of course, FDA's level is still federal. There isn't nearly as much devolution of power as there is stuff related to CDC. So I don't know that affects FDA directly, but I do think within HHS, there's a series of questions. If you could, forget about the Constitution, forget about the history, if you could design an emergency response system, whether we've devolved too much of that to local governments when it comes to public health.
Right. I mean, and internationally, I think we saw a good amount of very vital cooperation with counterpart regulatory bodies, and then with some kind of, overarching with WHO, that sort of thing. But there's also, there's friction points. So if one of them is getting out ahead on either in terms of a declaration about something or other, or on authorization of a product, then that there's pressure that comes on the agency, perhaps not unexpected. And I think the agency sort of both was adaptive, but also held the line on products for which it thought it needs to do its own analysis, its own review of the data. And there was a lot of work, to those who follow this, about the export of vaccines, the Biden administration facilitating the export to different countries. So we were involved in that to a significant degree.
And this one, I think, that one is a fairly complicated one, in part because I think that the level of transparency, for lots of reasons, including diplomacy, kind of State Department, national security reasons, like there was a level of transparency that people, I think, there's a lot of early misunderstandings about what vaccine sharing would look like and what the restrictions were and where the restrictions were coming from. So that's an area where I think that actually the truth was fairly complicated, and trying to transmit it and kind of share it in a way that could be understandable was also tricky. I do think that I often wonder whether COVID-19, a counterfactual world where the major companies producing the vaccine were not US based, they were based somewhere else in the world, how that would have played out differently. I mean, FDA really was, I think, kind of the lodestar in most of the early analysis and approval of the vaccination, and most of the rest of the world followed suit, rather than vice versa. But whether one could imagine, and this is also just the vaccines we got. I guess I should be careful here, because there are a bunch of vaccines that never were sought approval in the United States that are widely used around the world, right? So it's not that every vaccine went to FDA first, but the ones that have gotten the most widespread use in the US certainly have.
Right. And I just heard a comment this morning on from the highest levels of the agency in the context of monkeypox, but just emergencies generally, about the offshoring of manufacturing capacity, and should there be sort of more of a national policy on that. And one thing that was cited was flu vaccine in 2010, and then also in 2003. I actually don't remember that, but that was a meeting right before I got on this call. So, you know, I think something to consider.
Great. So maybe I'll shift our focus now from the international and the subnational to different kinds of entities, in particular public-private partnerships. And this has become an increasing part of FDA strategy, let's say over the long term, over the past 30 years, I think, is to realize, you know, that public-private partnerships have a lot to be said for them in some areas in terms of nimbly addressing emergencies. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to that, and then also some of the challenges, the interface between the public and the private when it comes to emergencies for FDA.
Sure. So it's interesting because the kind of work that we do in my office, it's mostly substantive food and drug work. I'd say 25 years ago, we did very little of what we now call leveraging work. We have a leveraging team, actually, is a cross-cutting team, of which I am the titular head. Although there's attorneys on the team that know far more about it than I do. But one of the things the types of issues that we deal with are cooperative agreements, MOUs, and public-private partnerships. Now, 25 years ago, we didn't do this work at all. I'm not sure, it must have been done elsewhere in OGC, but exactly as you said, the agency is increasingly involved in these sorts of arrangements, partnerships, and so we get involved as well. Now, it's an interesting question about how could these partnerships be used in an emergency setting. I mean, I think one would be potentially to try and improve public health data systems to get more robust data of this article in the New York Times today, I think, about the inadequacies of and how we're kind of flying blind to a certain degree. Now, I'm not sure exactly, I mean, the partnerships with, again, state or more local entities, that's kind of part of the fragmentation is kind of the problem. So, but I would think that it's something worth exploring, particularly from a consortium or aggregate approach of a way to approach the data and then the modernization data question, which is something that Rob Califf, he's always been interested in, you know, as a clinician and a clinical trial guy at Duke, and then coming from Google. Some of the constraints are dealing with regulated industry and the ethical constraints, and then also conflict of interest, and then also if there's proprietary interest in the data, what we do with that. But I think it'd be something worth exploring.
That's very helpful. You know, it's funny, we started by talking about the period at the beginning of the pandemic where all eyes were on FDA, where everybody was working, 120% kind of effort and the like. And this, but so was the funding and the support from Congress and the support from infrastructure. We're now in a different phase where support has waned, not just from Congress, I suppose, but also among the public in terms of fatigue at masking, trying to get people to get their boosters. I got mine last week, public service announcement, get your booster. But it turns out that actually interest in boosters and setting up for appointments, much easier to get an appointment than it was the first time around, which is probably a bad thing. I'm curious to know, whether you think that this phase of kind of pandemic fatigue presents new challenges for the agency in terms of how it does its business, and also whether you're seeing any spillover. So I wonder, a little bit of the monkeypox response. I mean, totally, they're apples and oranges, to be fair, but I do wonder whether some of the fatigue in terms of, measures of kind of security and behavioral changes people have made, whether we're seeing that and whether this is going to continue into the flu season and the like. So anything you want to say about kind of how pandemic fatigue is affecting the strategy of the agency and how the agency does its job?
Just that I concur with the observation. I think it's entirely accurate. There's a lot of fatigue going around within the agency, in the public, and also on the Hill. for continuing to fund some of these efforts. The agency's put a lot into some of the supplemental requests, and some of which are from HHS, and and understandably the Hill wants to see a bang for its buck, and there's been certain accounting for the money that's been received, but I don't know going forward what exactly is going to happen, but it doesn't. I don't know if it bodes well for the booster campaign coming up, or as to who actually is going to get vaccinated. Again, this morning, somebody sent me a tweet from the commissioner. I think it was legit, and said, hey, they didn't run this by us, but he retweeted a picture of the secretary receiving his booster. And the commissioner along this line, I guess I'm trying to be pithy or whatever. He said, if I had guns like that, or if I had biceps like that, I'd give up all my bow ties or something. But yeah, get your boosters. That's great. I need to get mine, but I don't know what we do for that segment of the population that is I don't know, is exceedingly skeptical, shall we say, and how we convince them. And hopefully things, again, I think things are trending in the right direction for infant formula and monkeypox. Hopefully they will for the pandemic as well, but I guess we shall see.
Great. Well, I know we're going to let you go in a few minutes. Maybe I'll just sneak in one more question, if that's okay, which is a little bit, we have a bunch of law students in the audience, also junior attorneys who have an interest in food and drug law. I'm curious, you've been at the agency quite a while now. But you see, and you've hired a lot of great people, many from my former students who've now been in the agency, cycled out, cycled back in a second time, like Rob Califf, right? A little bit having a second run at FDA. I'm wondering if you had advice to people who are interested or think they might be interested or should be interested in this area, whether there's any pitch you want to make or whether you have any advice to these folks about thinking about a career in food and drug law. I can say everybody I know who's ever chosen this as their specialty has never been disappointed, but you may have more specific things to say or more specific insights to share.
I would say that if you may be interested, to the students out there, to try and take advantage of some of the opportunities at the law school, a course or maybe multiple courses, maybe doing some research. And then if you're looking around for opportunities, professional opportunities in the area, you certainly can apply to my office. We're always looking for folks, provided we have the budget to hire. One thing that's different over the last 30 years is that elsewhere in the agency, there are far more people with law degrees than there were before. Now they're regulatory counsel. Strictly speaking, they're not practicing law, but there's some very talented folks who are doing very interesting things like reg writing, policy development, compliance, that sort of thing. So that's another area for you to check out. And I would like just to give a plug for federal service. Again, I'm kind of getting towards the end of my run, but I never planned to stay this long, and it's certainly, not without its frustrations at times. But if you take a look what's going on in our country, I mean, we need more good folks in government. It's not a partisan thing. I mean, there's different ways of looking at food and drug law. How do we spur innovation? How should we be more on the consumer protection side? That's all. But we need to be able to debate it, and we need good people to do the work and to help observe the rule of law, right? So I think sometimes as I feel a little doubtful about the future, but what a great opportunity here to speak to these incredibly talented folks that you have. So I would urge you just to consider it, right? And if not at FDA, maybe elsewhere, if you're interested in health law and HHS, or elsewhere in the federal government, DOJ, if you're interested in litigation, you can have an incredibly rich experience. And if you're more junior in your career, you'll get a lot of responsibility fast. So.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. And thank you to the audience for sticking with us. And a big round of applause to you, Mark. And we hope you'll join us for future programming. Also check out our blog, Bill of Health, and add yourself to the newsletter if you're not on already to hear about more great events like this. Thank you so much for the time, Mark.
Thank you very much. It's been a real honor, as I said, to be with you. So thank you. And best of luck to you all.